The silence in Eleanor Vance's house was not a peaceful absence of noise, it was an active, crushing physical weight. It was a heavy, dense silence that settled into the old oak floorboards and hung suspended in the dust motes catching the weak afternoon sunlight. It was the silence of a life that had abruptly stopped forward momentum. At 62 years old, Eleanor was a woman composed entirely of sharp angles and faded colours. She had spent 35 years teaching high school English in the small windswept town of Cedar Hollow, Montana. She had built a reputation as a stern, unyielding force in the classroom, demanding absolute discipline and intellectual rigour from generations of teenagers who would rather be outside hunting or fixing pickup trucks. But outside the classroom, her world had been defined by a deep, chaotic warmth. Her husband, Arthur, had been a boisterous, larger-than-life man who ran the local hardware store. He was constantly tracking mud into the kitchen, singing off-key to old country radio stations, and filling the large Victorian house with the smell of sawdust and strong coffee. Their son David had inherited his father's kinetic energy. He was a bright, restless boy who had joined the Army Rangers immediately after graduating from his mother's high school, driven by a deep sense of duty and a desperate need to see the world beyond the jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Mountain. The silence began when Arthur's heart simply stopped on a Tuesday morning while he was stocking shelves. It was a massive, catastrophic myocardial infarction that killed him before he hit the linoleum floor. The silence deepened, becoming absolute and suffocating. 3 years later, when 2 solemn military officers arrived at Eleanor's front door holding a perfectly folded American flag, David had been killed by an improvised explosive device during a routine patrol in the Arghandab River Valley. Eleanor didn't break down. She didn't scream or weep in public. She accepted the flag with the same stern, unyielding posture she used to correct a student's grammar. But when she retired at the end of that academic year, retreating fully into the large, empty house, the silence finally conquered her. She stopped baking, she stopped playing the old upright piano in the parlour. She maintained a rigid, mechanical routine designed exclusively to pass the time between waking and sleeping. She would sit in her rocking chair by the front window, a quilt draped over her thin legs, watching the seasons cycle brutally across the Montana landscape, feeling entirely disconnected from the turning of the earth. She was waiting for the end, trapped in a sterile, silent purgatory of her own making. On a bitterly cold morning in late November, exactly 5 years after Arthur's death, the silence finally became too heavy to bear. The snow had begun to fall heavily, burying the town of Cedar Hollow under a pristine, blinding white blanket. Eleanor sat in her chair, watching the flakes spiral down. She realized with a sudden terrifying clarity that if she died in this chair, it might be weeks before anyone noticed. The mail carrier might eventually complain about the overflowing box, but there was no one left who expected her to answer the phone. The realization didn't spark fear, it sparked a deep, visceral revulsion. She was a teacher. She had spent her life shaping chaos into order. She would not allow her life to end in a pathetic, forgotten whimper. She needed an anchor. She needed something that required her to participate in the physical world. She stood up, ignoring the sharp ache in her arthritic knees. She put on her heavy wool coat, wrapped a thick scarf around her neck, and found the keys to her old Subaru station wagon. She drove slowly through the falling snow, navigating the treacherous, unplowed streets of Cedar Hollow, heading toward the county animal control facility located on the industrial outskirts of town. The shelter was a bleak utilitarian concrete block building that smelled sharply of industrial bleach, wet fur, and ambient anxiety. As Eleanor pushed open the heavy glass doors, she was hit by a wall of deafening noise. Dozens of dogs, sensing the arrival of a human, began barking frantically, a chaotic symphony of desperation, and Eleanor didn't flinch at the noise. She walked to the front desk, where a young, exhausted-looking woman in blue scrubs was typing on a computer. "Can Mort help you?" the young woman asked, raising her voice over the din. "Mort am looking for a companion," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the sharp, authoritative cadence of a seasoned educator. An older cat. Something quiet. Something that has been overlooked. The young woman sighed, a look of profound weariness crossing her face. We have plenty of those. Ma'am. The older ones. They usually don't make it out of here. Follow me. She led Eleanor through a heavy metal door into the feline holding area. The noise here was less aggressive, but the atmosphere was heavier, filled with a quiet, pervasive despair. Rows of stainless steel cages lined the walls, each containing a cat staring blankly out through the wire mesh. Eleanor walked slowly down the aisle, looking into each cage. She felt a deep ache in her chest, a resonance with the trapped, isolated animals. This is Barnaby, the young woman said, pointing to a large, overweight tabby sleeping heavily in the corner of a cage. He's 10 years old. His owner passed away. He's very gentle, but nobody wants him. Eleanor looked at Barnaby. He was a sweet animal, and he deserved a home. But looking at his peaceful, sleeping form, she felt nothing. She needed an anchor. Yes, but she needed an anchor that could pull her back from the abyss, not one that would simply sink with her. She continued down the aisle. As she approached the very back of the room, near a heavy metal door marked isolation offers personal only, she noticed a strange, heavy tension in the air. The other cats in the nearby cages were huddled in the far corners, refusing to look toward the isolation door. Eleanor stopped. "What is in there?" she asked, pointing her gloved hand toward the heavy metal door. The young woman in scrubs stopped, her eyes widening slightly. "Nothing you want to see." "Ma'am, that S-isolation. Animal control brought it in last night. It's scheduled for euthanasia at 3 o'clock today." "What is it?" Eleanor repeated, her voice dropping an octave, demanding an answer. "It's a feral," the young woman said, her voice trembling slightly. "A big one. They found it trapped in an illegal snare up near Black Pine Ridge. It's highly aggressive. The vet couldn't even sedate it properly to check for injuries. It nearly tore his arm off. We were just waiting for the county supervisor to sign the order to put it down." Eleanor didn't know why she did it. Perhaps it was the echo of her son David, who had always possessed a reckless, defiant streak. Perhaps it was simply the profound, crushing boredom of her silent life demanding a violent disruption. "Open the door," Eleanor said. The young woman shook her head vigorously. "Ma'am, Mott absolutely cannot do that. It's against county regulations, and it's extremely dangerous. That animal is wild." Eleanor turned slowly, bringing the full, terrifying weight of a 35-year high school English teacher to bear on the young shelter worker. She didn't raise her voice. She simply lowered her chin, fixed the young woman with an icy, unyielding stare, and spoke with absolute authority. "What taught your mother, Jessica?" Eleanor said softly. Mott remember when she struggled to pass American literature. Mott also remember the county regulations regarding public access to impounded animals prior to scheduled euthanasia. "Now you will open that door, or Mott will call the county supervisor myself and explain why you are impeding a potential adoption." Jessica swallowed hard, completely withered by the stare. Her hand shook as she reached for the large ring of keys on her belt. She walked to the heavy metal door, inserted a key, and turned the deadbolt. The lock clicked loudly in the quiet room. "Mort met not going in there with you," Jessica whispered, stepping back. "Please, just look through the window." Eleanor didn't reply. She grasped the heavy metal handle, took a deep breath, and pulled the door open. The isolation room was small, lit only by a single, harsh fluorescent bulb buzzing angrily on the ceiling. The smell was intense, a sharp, metallic mix of blood, fear, and wild adrenaline. There was only one cage in the center of the room. It was an industrial-grade steel enclosure designed for large, dangerous dogs. Eleanor stepped into the room and the heavy door closed behind her with a dull thud. She walked slowly toward the cage. Huddled in the back corner, pressed as far away from the steel mesh as physically possible, was the animal. It wasn't a feral house cat. It was a massive, fully grown female bobcat. Eleanor stopped 3 feet from the cage, her breath catching in her throat. She had seen bobcats from a distance in the Bitterroots. Fast, shadowy figures disappearing into the timber. She had never been this close to one. The wildcat was a masterpiece of specialized evolution, but she was in horrific condition. Her thick, tawny coat, heavily patterned with dark rosettes, was matted verkepet mud and dried blood. Her right front leg was swollen to twice its normal size, bearing the deep, jagged laceration of a wire snare. But it wasn't the physical injuries that locked Eleanor in place. It was the psychological terror radiating from the animal. The shelter worker had called her highly aggressive. That was a human misinterpretation. As Eleanor stood there, the bobcat didn't lunge at the cage wire. She didn't let out a terrifying, guttural roar. Instead, the massive apex predator flattened herself against the cold steel floor. Her tufted black ears were pinned tightly against her skull. Her body was trembling violently. Deep, involuntary shivers racking her muscular frame. She looked up at Eleanor. Her eyes were wide, pale amber, and filled with a stark, absolute, paralyzing terror. She was a wild thing, a creature born to dominate the high timber, currently trapped in a sterile, loud concrete box, surrounded by the scent of 100 other terrified animals, waiting to die. She was completely, utterly broken. Eleanor felt a physical shockwave hit her chest. It was a sensation she hadn't experienced since she had stood over her husband's grave. It was a profound, immediate empathy, a recognition of a shared, shattering grief. She saw the wildcat's terror, and she recognized her own crushing, silent isolation mirrored in those pale amber eyes. "You aren't aggressive, are you?" Eleanor whispered, her voice cracking for the first time in 5 years. "You just terrified." The bobcat didn't move. She just stared at the old woman, her breathing rapid and shallow. Eleanor didn't think about liability. She didn't think about the logistical nightmare of bringing an apex predator into a residential Victorian home. She didn't think about the county regulations or the sheer physical danger. She turned around, walked out of the isolation room, and closed the heavy metal door. Jessica, the shelter worker, was standing in the aisle, looking pale and anxious. "Did you see it?" Jessica asked nervously. "It's a monster." Eleanor walked directly to the young woman. She didn't look angry, she looked terrifyingly purposeful. "Mort want the adoption paperwork?" Eleanor demanded, her voice ringing clear and authoritative down the aisle of stainless steel cages. Jessica stared at her, completely bewildered. "Ma'am." "For Barnaby." "Absolutely not," Eleanor said, pointing a stiff, gloved finger back toward the isolation room. "For the bobcat." Jessica's mouth fell open. "Mrs. Vance, you can tea. That's a wild animal. It's illegal. You need specialized permits. And even if you had them, that animal is scheduled to be destroyed in 2 hours. The supervisor already signed the preliminary order." "Then you had better get the supervisor on the phone," Eleanor said, pulling a worn leather checkbook from her heavy wool coat. "Because Mum am not leaving this building without her. And if you try to put a needle in that animal, you will have to physically remove me from the isolation room first." The ensuing hour was a chaotic battle of wills that completely disrupted the normal operations of the Cedar Hollow Animal Shelter. The county supervisor, an exhausted man named Miller, was called down from his office. He attempted to reason with Eleanor, explaining the massive liability issues, the biological impossibility of domesticating a wildcat, and the severe danger the animal posed. Eleanor countered every argument with the ruthless logical precision of a master debater. She cited obscure state wildlife rehabilitation statutes. She threatened a massive public relations nightmare involving the local newspaper, which was edited by a former student of hers. She pointed out that the animal had been brought in illegally, trapped in a banned snare, and that the county had failed to follow proper protocol for dealing with injured native wildlife. Supervisor Miller, realizing he was engaged in an unwinnable war of attrition with a woman who had nothing left to lose, finally capitulated. "Fine," Miller said, rubbing his temples in exasperation. Mort met, signing her over as a rehabilitation transfer. "But understand this, Mrs. Vance. If that animal attacks you, if it escapes and hurts someone in town, the county claims absolute zero liability, and you are legally required to keep it secured." "She will be secured," Eleanor replied coldly, signing her name forcefully on a stack of triplicate forms. The logistics of moving the terrified bobcat from the isolation room to Eleanor S. Subaru were complex and dangerous. The shelter veterinarian, heavily padded and wearing thick leather gauntlets, managed to inject a mild sedative into the wildcat using a long-pole syringe. The sedative did knock the animal out. It simply dulled the sharp, panicked edge of her adrenaline, rendering her groggy and uncoordinated. They used a heavy-duty transport crate, sliding the massive, limp body and securing the heavy steel door. When Eleanor finally drove away from the shelter, the snow falling even heavier now, the heavy crate taking up the entire back of the station wagon, she felt a strange, terrifying exhilaration. For 5 years, her life had been defined by a slow, agonizing wait for the end. Now, sitting in the back of her car, was a 40-pound biological explosive. The silence was over. When Eleanor arrived at her large Victorian home, she backed the Subaru as close to the side entrance as possible. The sedative was beginning to wear off. From inside the heavy plastic crate, Eleanor could hear the low, vibrating growl of the waking predator. It wasn't a roar, it was a deep, guttural warning, a sound that vibrated through the metal frame of the car. She enlisted the help of her neighbour, a burly, retired mechanic named Frank, to carry the heavy crate into the house. "Eleanor, what in Goddess' name is in this thing?" Frank grunted, his face red as they manoeuvred the awkward crate through the side door and into the large, empty laundry room. "It smells like a zoo." "It's a rescue." "Frank," Eleanor said simply. "Thank you for your help." She ushered Frank out of the house, locking the side door securely. She was alone. She walked into the laundry room. The room was spacious, with a heavy tile floor and strong, solid core doors. She had prepared it hastily while Frank was walking over, moving the chemicals to high shelves and placing a heavy ceramic bowl of water and a thick, soft wool blanket in the corner. She stood in front of the heavy transport crate. The low growl was constant now. The animal inside was fully awake, trapped in a small, dark space, surrounded by unfamiliar smells and the terrifying scent of a human. Eleanor didn't wear leather gauntlets. She didn't carry a broom to defend herself. She simply walked to the crate, knelt down, and unlatched the heavy steel door. She pulled the door open and immediately stepped back, pressing her back against the wall of the laundry room, making herself as small and unthreatening as possible. For a long minute, nothing happened. The interior of the crate was dark. Then, a massive, heavily furred paw stepped out into the light of the laundry room. The bobcat emerged slowly, her body incredibly low to the ground, her belly almost touching the cold tile. Her movements were agonizingly cautious, her tufted ears swiveling frantically, her pale amber eyes wide and dilated. She limped heavily, favouring her injured right leg. She didn't look at Eleanor. She ignored the water bowl and the soft wool blanket. Driven by the absolute, biological imperative to find cover, the wildcat scanned the room. She spotted the narrow, dark gap between the heavy washing machine and the wall. She squeezed her massive body into the impossibly tight space, her thick fur scraping against the metal appliance. She jammed herself as far back into the darkness as she could go, pressing her back against the wall, her eyes glowing faintly in the shadows. She let out a sharp, defensive hiss, a clear warning to stay away. Eleanor didn't move. She stood against the wall, watching the dark space behind the washing machine. "It's all right," Eleanor whispered into the quiet room. "You re-safe here." The wildcat didn't respond. The silence of the house settled back in, but it was no longer an empty, crushing silence. It was a tense, electric silence, thick with a scent of wild pine and fear. Eleanor Vance, the stern, unyielding schoolteacher who had lost everything, had brought a monster into her home, and for the first time in 5 years, as she turned off the laundry room light and walked into her kitchen, she felt a flicker of profound, terrifying purpose. The first week of cohabitation was not a beautiful, cinematic montage of interspecies bonding. It was a grueling, tense standoff. The laundry room became a demilitarized zone. The Bobcat, which Eleanor had quietly named Harper after the author of her favorite novel, refused to leave the dark sanctuary behind the washing machine. Harper was operating on pure, traumatized instinct. She was an apex predator confined in an artificial environment, surrounded by the terrifying scent of humanity, and suffering from a severe physical injury. Her defense mechanism was absolute stillness and invisibility. Eleanor understood this. She didn't try to force interaction. She didn't try to pet the wildcat or speak to her in the high-pitched, soothing tones people use for domestic pets. Eleanor approached the situation with the same strict, predictable routine she had used to manage unruly classrooms for 3 decades. She established rules of engagement. Every morning at exactly 7 o'clock, Eleanor would enter the laundry room. She would not turn on the overhead light, relying instead on the weak grey daylight filtering through the frosted glass window. She moved slowly, her hands visible. "Good morning, Harper," Eleanor would say, her voice flat and conversational. She would place a heavy ceramic plate on the floor, about 4 feet from the washing machine. On the plate were generous portions of raw chicken or beef, purchased in bulk from the local butcher. Eleanor would then retreat, sitting on a small wooden stool near the door, and read a book. She didn't look at the dark gap behind the washing machine. She simply occupied the space, reading quietly for exactly 30 minutes. For the first 3 days, the food remained untouched while Eleanor was in the room. The moment she left and closed the door, the plate would be stripped clean in seconds. But on the 4th morning, driven by the immense caloric requirements necessary to heal her injured leg, Harper broke the stalemate. Eleanor was reading a chapter of Thoreau, her eyes on the page, when she heard the soft, almost imperceptible scrape of claws on the tile floor. She didn't look up. She kept her breathing steady and her body perfectly still. Harper emerged from the shadows. She moved incredibly low to the ground, her massive shoulder muscles bunching with tension. She limped heavily, dragging her injured right leg slightly. She reached the plate. She didn't eat immediately. She stared intently at the old woman sitting on the stool, her pale amber eyes locked onto Eleanor's face, searching for any sign of aggression or sudden movement. When Eleanor simply turned a page of her book, Ignoring the massive predator 4 feet away, Harper finally lowered her head and began to eat. The sound was terrifying. It wasn't the delicate nibbling of a house cat, it was the violent, mechanical shearing of muscle and bone. Harper ate with desperate speed, her eyes darting constantly around the room. When she finished, she immediately retreated back into the darkness behind the washing machine, letting out a soft, warning hiss. "Good girl," Eleanor said quietly, closing her book. It was a microscopic victory, but it established the foundation of trust. Eleanor was not a threat, she was a provider of resources. The primary concern was Harper's injured leg. The snare had cut deep into the muscle, and while the shelter vet had administered a long-lasting antibiotic before the transfer, the wound needed to be kept clean to prevent necrosis. Eleanor knew she couldn't take the wildcat to a local vet. They would immediately report her, and the animal would be confiscated and destroyed. She had to manage the medical care herself. She purchased a large bottle of medical-grade chlorhexidine solution and a spray bottle. On the 7th morning, after Harper had finished her roux of kept chicken and was retreating to the shadows, Eleanor stood up. Harper froze, her body tensing, a low growl starting in her chest. "Hold on," Eleanor said firmly, stepping forward. She didn't reach for the animal. She aimed the spray bottle at the injured leg and squeezed the trigger, delivering a sharp stream of the antiseptic solution directly onto the jagged wound. The shock of the cold liquid caused Harper to flinch violently. She spun around, letting out a terrifying, guttural snarl, her jaws snapping the air just inches from Eleanor's hand. Eleanor didn't back away. She didn't flinch. She stood her ground, looking directly into the furious amber eyes of the apex predator. "I'm not going to hurt you," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the absolute, uncompromising authority of a teacher demanding order. "But you will not infect that leg in my house. Do you understand?" Harper stared at her, the snarl fading into a low, vibrating hum. The wildcat seemed confused by the lack of fear. She blinked slowly, then turned and squeezed back behind the washing machine, licking the bitter antiseptic from her fur. This became their medical routine. It was tense, dangerous, and built entirely on a razor-thin margin of mutual respect. By the end of the 2nd week, the physical healing was evident. Harper was no longer dragging the leg, and the wound was closing cleanly. As her physical strength returned, the confines of the laundry room became insufficient. The biological imperative to patrol and establish a territory overrode her fear of the human environment. The exploration began at night. Eleanor, a light sleeper since the death of her son, would lie awake in her upstairs bedroom, listening to the silence of the old Victorian house. Around 2 a.m, she would hear the soft, distinct click of the laundry room door being pushed open. Eleanor had stopped latching it completely. Then came the silence. A 40-pound apex predator moving through a house is a masterclass in stealth. Eleanor couldn't hear footsteps. She couldn't hear claws on the hardwood floors. The only indication of Harper's movement was the subtle displacement of air and the occasional soft creak of a floorboard that Eleanor knew intimately. One night, Eleanor quietly slipped out of bed, wrapped a heavy wool robe around her shoulders, and walked silently to the top of the main staircase. The house was dark, illuminated only by the pale moonlight filtering through the large front windows. She looked down into the parlour. Harper was standing in the centre of the room. She was magnificent, a creature of the wild perfectly framed by the antique furniture and the floral wallpaper. Her tufted ears were swivelling constantly, processing the myriad of unfamiliar sounds in the old house. She moved to the large front window and leapt effortlessly onto the wide wooden sill, landing without a single sound. She sat there, a massive, spotted silhouette against the moonlight, staring out at the snow-covered street. She was looking at the dark timber of the Bitterroot Mountains rising in the distance. Eleanor sat on the top stair, watching the wildcat. The profound loneliness that had defined her existence for 5 years felt suddenly distant. The house was no longer a silent tomb, it was a shared territory. It was during one of these nocturnal explorations that Eleanor discovered the dark truth about Harper's past. She had come downstairs early one morning, before dawn, to find Harper asleep on the heavy rug in front of the cold fireplace. The wildcat was sprawled on her side, deeply relaxed in the quiet house. Eleanor walked slowly into the room, maintaining a respectful distance. As the first light of dawn crept through the windows, illuminating the wildcat's thick coat, Eleanor noticed something unnatural. Deep in the thick fur around Harper's neck, hidden by the dark rosettes, was a wide, black band. It wasn't a collar. It looked like a heavy piece of industrial webbing, pulled incredibly tight. Eleanor moved closer, her heart rate accelerating. Harper stirred, opening one pale amber eye, but she didn't growl. She allowed the old woman to approach. Eleanor knelt down and gently parted the thick fur around the neck. The black band was a heavy-duty tracking collar, the kind used by researchers to monitor large predators. But this collar was old, frayed, and far too small. It had clearly been placed on the animal when she was a juvenile and had never been adjusted or removed. It was cutting deeply into the muscle, restricting her breathing and causing a permanent rubbed raw scar around her throat. Eleanor felt a cold wave of fury wash over. This animal hadn't just stumbled into an illegal snare. She had been collared. She was part of a program, either an illegal exotic breeding operation or a horribly mismanaged research project. She had lived her entire life with this heavy, constricting plastic choking her, a constant physical reminder of human cruelty and control. "What met going to take it off?" Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling vecipite at anger. She stood up, went to the kitchen, and retrieved a pair of heavy-duty trauma shears from a first aid kit. She returned to the parlour. Harper was sitting up now, watching her warily. "Hold still," Eleanor commanded softly. She approached the wildcat. This was the most dangerous interaction they had attempted. Touching a wild predator's neck, the most vulnerable part of its anatomy, was an invitation for a lethal defensive strike. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She placed her left hand firmly on the thick muscles of Harper's shoulder, anchoring the animal. With her right hand, she slid the blunt edge of the heavy shears under the tight plastic collar. Harper let out a sharp, terrifying hiss, her body tensing like a coiled spring. Her massive jaws opened, exposing the lethal canine teeth, inches from Eleanor's forearm. Mort said, "Hold still," Eleanor repeated, her voice absolutely steady, betraying no fear. She squeezed the heavy shears. The thick plastic snapped with a loud crack. Eleanor pulled the collar away, dropping it onto the floor. Harper scrambled backward instantly, putting 10 feet between herself and the old woman. She stood there, breathing heavily, shaking her head violently as if trying to dislodge a ghost. Then she stopped. She took a deep breath, the air rushing unimpeded into her lungs for the first time in years. The physical restriction was gone. She looked at Eleanor. The pale amber eyes were wide, the pupils dilated in the dim light. She didn't hiss. She didn't growl. She walked slowly back to the old woman. She stopped inches from Eleanor's legs. Then, the massive apex predator leaned forward and pressed the side of her heavy, scarred head firmly against Eleanor's shin. She initiated a deep, rumbling purr that vibrated through the floorboards. It was an act of profound, biological gratitude. It was the moment the wildcat officially claimed the stern, broken schoolteacher as her own, the climax of their extraordinary bond. However, did not occur in the parlour. It occurred exactly 3 weeks later, driven by an event that would shatter Eleanor's carefully constructed emotional armor and bring her to her knees. It began, as all things did with Harper, in the absolute silence of the night. The second floor of the Victorian house was a geographical representation of Eleanor's grief. She lived entirely on the first floor. The master bedroom, where she and Arthur had slept for 30 years, remained exactly as it had been on the morning he died, the door pulled firmly shut. But it was the door at the end of the long upstairs hallway that held the true, crushing gravity of the house. That was David S.'s room. Eleanor had not crossed that threshold since the day she received the folded flag. The room was a museum dedicated to a life abruptly terminated. It contained his high school track trophies, his massive collection of worn paperback science fiction novels, and the heavy canvas duffel bag he had packed the night before he left for basic training. The door was always closed. It was the only boundary in the house that Eleanor actively enforced. A silent, locked vault of memory she refused to open. As Harper Gereve kept stronger and more comfortable in her new territory, her nocturnal patrols inevitably extended to the second floor. Eleanor would hear the soft, heavy thud of the wildcat's paws ascending the wooden stairs. She would listen as Harper paced the hallway, pausing at the closed door of the master bedroom, sniffing the gap beneath the frame. But Harper always spent the most time outside David S.'s room. Eleanor, lying awake on the first floor, could hear the distinct sound of the bobcat's claws scratching gently against the heavy wood of that specific door. It was a soft, rhythmic sound filled with a predatory curiosity. The scent of a young man trapped and preserved in the dust for 5 years was clearly fascinating to the animal. "Leave it alone," Harper, Eleanor would whisper into the darkness, knowing the wildcat could hear her. But Harper, driven by the biological imperative to understand every inch of her territory, was relentlessly curious about the locked room. In late January, the most severe winter storm of the decade struck Cedar Hollow. The meteorologists called it a bomb cyclone. The atmospheric pressure plummeted, unleashing a catastrophic combination of heavy, wet snow and hurricane-force winds. The ancient power grid of the small mountain town failed almost immediately, plunging the valley into freezing darkness. Eleanor was prepared for the cold. She had lived in Montana her entire life. She built a massive roaring fire in the large parlor fireplace, dragging heavy oak logs from the indoor stack in the mudroom. She lit kerosene lamps, the warm yellow light casting long dancing shadows against the floral wallpaper. The temperature outside dropped to 25 below zero. The wind screamed around the eaves of the old Victorian house, rattling the heavy storm windows with terrifying violence. Harper hated the storm. The wildcat was a creature of the deep timber, accustomed to the silent, insulated protection of the snow-laden evergreens. The chaotic, mechanical noise of the wind tearing at the wooden house deeply unsettled her. She abandoned her usual solitary patrols and spent the first night of the storm pressed tightly against Eleanor's legs as the old woman sat in her rocking chair by the fire. The massive predator was seeking comfort, her tufted ears pinned back, her pale eyes wide with anxiety. "It's just whined," Eleanor murmured, her calloused hand resting gently on the thick fur between the wildcat's shoulders. "The house will hold." The true test of their bond occurred on the second night of the blackout. The temperature inside the house had dropped significantly, hovering just above freezing in the rooms furthest from the parlor fire. Eleanor, exhausted from hauling wood and the pervasive, bone-chilling cold, had fallen into a deep, heavy sleep in her chair, wrapped in 3 layers of wool quilts. She awoke with a start. The fire had burned down to weak, glowing embers. The parlor was freezing, but it was to the cold that had woken her. It was the absolute silence. The wind had died down, the storm finally breaking, leaving behind a suffocating, heavy quiet. Eleanor sat up, pulling the quilts tighter around her shoulders. She looked down at the floor next to her chair. Harper was gone. Eleanor felt a sudden, sharp spike of panic. The house was completely dark. "Harper!" she called out, her voice raspy and loud in the empty room. There was no answering trill. Eleanor stood up, her joints aching painfully in the cold. She picked up a kerosene lamp from the table, turning up the wick. The yellow light pushed back the shadows. She walked slowly into the hallway, moving toward the kitchen. The house was empty. Then she heard a sound from the second floor. It was a heavy, distinct thud, followed by the metallic click of a latch mechanism turning. Eleanor froze, the kerosene lamp trembling slightly in her hand. She moved to the base of the main staircase and looked up. The hallway above was pitch black. "Harper," she called again, her voice carrying a sharp edge of command. Silence. Eleanor began to climb the stairs, the wooden steps creaking loudly under her weight. She reached the top landing, holding the lamp high. The door to the master bedroom was still closed, but the door at the end of the hallway, David S. door, was wide open. Eleanor stopped breathing. The air in her lungs turned to ice. The heavy brass handle on David S. door was a complex, antique lever mechanism. It required significant downward force to open. It was not a door a domestic cat could push open, but a 40-pound apex predator, possessing massive upper body strength and the ability to stand nearly 4 feet tall on its hind legs, could easily manipulate the lever. Harper had broken the perimeter. Eleanor walked slowly down the hallway, her heart hammering painfully against her ribs. The fear of confronting the preserved memory of her son was overwhelming, a physical barrier she had refused to cross for 5 years. She reached the open doorway and raised the kerosene lamp. The room was exactly as she remembered it. The narrow bed was neatly made. The vintage track posters hung on the walls. The air smelled faintly of old paper, dust, and the sharp, clean scent of the pine aftershave David had worn in high school. Harper was sitting in the center of the room. The massive wildcat was perfectly still, her tufted ears swiveling, her pale amber eyes reflecting the yellow light of the lamp. She was surrounded by the artifacts of a dead soldier, investigating the space with quiet, intense curiosity. "Get out of here," Eleanor whispered, her voice tight, tears instantly stinging her eyes. "You don't belong in here." Harper didn't move. She looked at Eleanor, then turned her head, focusing her attention on a specific object sitting on the small wooden desk near the window. It was David's old leather baseball glove. It was a heavy, worn piece of equipment, deeply creased and smelling of neatsfoot oil and dirt. He had loved that glove. He had spent hours in the backyard with Arthur, the sharp thwack of the baseball hitting the leather echoing through the summer evenings. Harper stood up. She walked to the desk, her movements incredibly fluid and silent. She stood on her hind legs, resting her massive front paws on the edge of the desk. She leaned forward, sniffing the heavy leather glove intently. Then she opened her jaws. "No!" Eleanor gasped, stepping into the room. But Harper didn't tear the leather. She didn't bite down with the lethal force of her carnassial teeth. She picked the glove up gently, gripping the thick wrist strap delicately in her front teeth. She dropped back down to the floor, the heavy glove hanging from her mouth. She turned and walked directly toward Eleanor. Eleanor backed out into the hallway, her mind unable to process the profound, impossible reality of the moment. Harper stopped in front of the old woman. She didn't drop the glove. She looked up, her pale eyes locking onto Eleanor's face. She let out a soft, muffled trill through the heavy leather. She was offering it to her. It was the most fundamental, intimate gesture a predator can make. She had entered the forbidden territory, identified an object that held the deepest, most complex scent profile of the missing human, and brought it back as a tribute. She was sharing the territory. She was acknowledging the grief. Eleanor dropped the kerosene lamp. It shattered on the hardwood floor, the glass breaking with a sharp crash, the small flame instantly going out in the darkness. She collapsed onto her knees in the dark hallway. She reached out with trembling hands and took the heavy leather glove from the wildcat's jaws. The smell of the oil and the dirt hit her instantly. A visceral, overwhelming sensory memory of her son, vibrant and alive, standing in the summer sun. The dam she had built to hold back the ocean of her grief finally, catastrophically failed. Eleanor Vance, the stern, unyielding teacher, buried her face in the cold, worn leather of the baseball glove and wept. It wasn't a quiet, dignified sorrow. It was a violent, tearing agony, 5 years of repressed, suffocating silence exploding out of her in ragged, desperate sobs. She cried for Arthur. She cried for David. She cried for the vast, terrifying emptiness of the world. She slumped forward, resting her forehead on the cold floorboards, her body shaking uncontrollably. In the darkness, she felt a heavy, warm weight press against her side. Harper didn't retreat from the sudden, violent display of human emotion. The apex predator lay down next to the old woman, curling her massive body tightly against Eleanor's ribs. She initiated a deep, incredibly loud purr, a rhythmic, vibrating engine of absolute, primal comfort. She rested her heavy, scarred head gently across Eleanor's outstretched arm. Eleanor wrapped her arm around the wildcat's thick neck, burying her tear-streaked face in the dense, spotted fur. The silence of the Victorian house was permanently broken. The storm outside had passed, and the storm inside had finally broken, leaving behind a profound, exhausted peace. The shelter director had begged her not to adopt the aggressive wildcat, warning her of the danger, the unpredictability, and the violence of the natural world. But lying on the floor in the dark, anchored by the massive predator that had brought her son's memory back from the void, Eleanor knew the truth. The wild was dangerous. Yes, but it was also capable of an empathy so profound, so devastatingly pure, that it could heal a heart that human medicine and time had entirely failed to mend. The morning after the blackout and the profound emotional collapse in the upstairs hallway dawned with a brilliant, blinding clarity. The storm had passed entirely, leaving the town of Cedar Hollow buried under 3 feet of pristine snow. The sky was a sharp, unyielding blue, and the morning sun reflected off the drifts with a fierce intensity that pierced the heavy Victorian curtains of Eleanor's house. Eleanor woke up on the floor of the hallway. She was stiff, cold, and exhausted, her muscles aching from sleeping on the hard wood. But as she opened her eyes, she realized something fundamental had changed within her architecture. The crushing, suffocating weight that had pressed against her chest for 5 years was gone. The grief hadn't vanished. The loss of Arthur and David would always be a permanent, jagged scar, but it was no longer an active, agonizing wound. It had been acknowledged. The dam had broken, the pressure had been released, and she felt incredibly, almost painfully light. She sat up slowly. David's old leather baseball glove was lying on the floor next to her knee. She picked it up. She didn't cry. She ran her thumb over the worn leather, tracing the deep creases where her son's hand had formed the pocket. She smiled, a small, quiet expression that she hadn't worn in half a decade. She looked down the hallway. Harper was lying on the top step of the stairs, her massive head resting on her front paws, watching Eleanor. The wildcat pale amber eyes were calm and unblinking. "Good morning, Harper," Eleanor said. her voice clear and steady. Harper didn't hiss or retreat. She let out a soft, vibrating hum and slowly closed her eyes, entirely relaxed in the presence of the old woman. Eleanor stood up. She walked into David S.'s room, holding the baseball glove. She placed it carefully back on the wooden desk. She looked around the room, taking in the posters, the neatly made bed, the heavy canvas duffel bag. It was no longer a museum of grief. It was just a room, filled with the artifacts of a young man who had lived a vibrant, albeit brief, life. She didn't close the door when she left. She left it wide open, allowing the stale air to circulate, welcoming the memory back into the flow of the house. The physical and psychological thaw of Eleanor Vance became increasingly apparent to the town of Cedar Hollow in the following weeks. The first indication was the massive, weekly orders of raw meat from the local butcher. Before Harper, Eleanor's grocery runs had been sparse and utilitarian canned soup, tea, perhaps a small loaf of bread. She ate simply to sustain her biological functions, taking no pleasure in the preparation or consumption of food. Now, she required 10 pounds of raw chicken, beef liver, and occasionally, when the butcher could source it, venison scraps. Mr. Henderson, the elderly butcher who had known Arthur for decades, was bewildered when Eleanor first placed the order. 10 pounds of raw chicken quarters. Eleanor, he asked, wiping his bloody hands on his white apron, are you hosting a neighbourhood barbecue in the middle of February? No. Arthur, Eleanor replied, her tone brisk but not unkind. Mott have acquired a companion with a very specific, high-protein diet. A companion, Henderson raised a bushy eyebrow. A dog? What day they to know you were looking for a dog? What kind? She is a rescue, Eleanor said smoothly, dodging the specific classification. She is large, highly active, and requires a strictly carnivorous regimen to recover from an injury. Henderson wrapped the massive bundle of meat in thick butcher paper. Well, whatever it is, it's eating better than most folks in town. It's good to see you out and about. Eleanor, you re-looking. Sharper. Thank you, Mr. Henderson, Eleanor said, taking the heavy package. She was sharper. The necessity of caring for an apex predator required constant vigilance and mental engagement. She had to meticulously calculate Harper's caloric intake, balancing the protein and bone ratios to mimic the wild diet necessary for a bobcat-esque complex digestion. She spent her evenings reading dense veterinary texts on feline biology and physiology, transforming her sterile isolation into an intense, focused study. She learned that a bobcat-esque digestive system is a marvel of evolutionary efficiency, incredibly short and highly acidic, designed to process raw meat rapidly while destroying harmful bacteria. She learned about the tapetum lucidum in their eyes, the reflective layer that gave Harper her terrifying glowing gaze in the dark, allowing her to see in light levels 6 times lower than a human. As the bitter winter began to yield to the chaotic, muddy Montana spring, Eleanor witnessed the incredible biological mechanics of the wildcat firsthand. Harper began to shed her thick, winter undercoat. The house was suddenly filled with massive clumps of fine, grey-brown fur. Eleanor, armed with a heavy-duty vacuum cleaner and an industrial wire brush, initiated a grooming routine. It was a process built entirely on the deep trust they had established during the night of the blackout. Harper would lie on the large rug in the parlour, her body stretched out in a patch of afternoon sunlight. Eleanor would kneel beside her, running the wire brush firmly through the thick coat, pulling out massive handfuls of dead fur. The wildcat didn't tolerate this from anyone else. But with Eleanor, she would close her eyes, stretch her massive neck, and initiate a purr so loud it rattled the antique teacups in the nearby china cabinet. It was during these grooming sessions that Eleanor truly appreciated the terrifying physical power of the animal. Beneath the soft, spotted fur, Harper was composed entirely of dense, explosive muscle. Her forelegs were incredibly thick, designed for grappling and holding down struggling prey. Her hind legs were disproportionately long, providing the massive leverage required for her signature 10-foot leaps. She was a biological weapon, resting peacefully under the hands of an elderly schoolteacher. However, this peaceful domestic routine was fundamentally illegal, and the reality of the outside world eventually intruded upon their sanctuary. In late April, the county supervisor, Miller, called Eleanor Mrs. Vance, Miller said, his voice carrying an administrative weariness. "Mort met calling regarding the feral animal you adopted from the shelter back in November." Eleanor felt a cold spike of adrenaline. She kept her voice perfectly level. "Yes. Supervisor Miller. What about her?" County regulations require a follow-up inspection for any animal transferred under the rehabilitation clause, particularly one classified as highly aggressive, Miller explained. "Mort need to verify the animal is properly secured and is not posing a threat to the community. Mort won't be coming by your residence tomorrow afternoon." Eleanor's mind raced. If Miller saw Harper, a fully grown 40-pound apex predator, wandering freely through a residential Victorian house, sleeping on antique rugs and playing with baseball gloves, he would immediately call the state wildlife authorities. Harper would be confiscated, tranquilized, and likely euthanized. "Mott understand," Supervisor Eleanor said smoothly. "Tomorrow afternoon is fine." She hung up the phone and looked at Harper, who was currently napping on the back of the sofa, her long legs dangling over the edge. "We have a problem," Eleanor told the sleeping wildcat. The preparation for Miller's visit required a massive tactical deception. Eleanor moved Harper's food and water bowls from the kitchen into the heavy-duty transport crate in the laundry room. She scrubbed the floors, attempting to remove the pervasive scent of wild pine and raw meat that had seeped into the house. The next afternoon, when the supervisor's county vehicle pulled into the driveway, Eleanor was waiting on the front porch. "Good afternoon, Mr. Miller," Eleanor said, leading him into the house. Miller stepped inside, wiping his boots on the mat. He looked around the pristine parlor, clearly surprised by the lack of destruction. "Where is she?" "Mrs. Vance?" he inquired. "Holding a clipboard. She is secured in the holding area, as per regulations," Eleanor said, leading him toward the laundry room. She had placed a heavy padlock on the outside of the laundry room door. She unlocked it and pushed the door open. The transport crate was sitting in the corner, the heavy steel door closed and latched. Inside the crate, Harper was lying down, her back to the door. Eleanor had not locked the crate. She had simply asked Harper to go inside, relying entirely on the wildcat's intelligence and their established bond. Harper, sensing the tension and the presence of a stranger, had complied, retreating to the dark, secure space. Miller peered into the dimly lit laundry room. He didn't approach the crate. "She's quiet," Miller noted, sounding suspicious. The shelter staff said she was highly aggressive, tearing at the bars, hissing at anyone who came near. She was terrified. "Mr. Miller," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with condescension. "The shelter is a chaotic, loud environment. Here, she is isolated, fed on a strict schedule, and unbothered. She sleeps most of the day." Harper, performing her role perfectly, let out a soft, sleepy yawn from inside the crate, the sound completely unthreatening. Miller checked a box on his clipboard. "And she hasn't shown any aggressive behavior toward you?" Mort did not interact with her beyond providing basic sustenance and cleaning the enclosure. Eleanor lied effortlessly, channeling her most severe teacher persona. She is a feral animal. Mort treat her with appropriate caution. Miller nodded, clearly intimidated by the old woman's authoritative demeanour and relieved that he didn't have to deal with a dangerous situation. All right, Mrs. Vance. Everything looks to be in order. The county considers the rehabilitation transfer successful. You won't hear from us again unless there's a complaint from a neighbour. There won't be, Eleanor said, leading him back to the front door. When Miller's car finally disappeared down the street, Eleanor locked the front door, leaned against it, and let out a long, shaky breath. She walked back to the laundry room and pushed the door open. Harper was already out of the crate. The wildcat was sitting on top of the washing machine, watching Eleanor Vance at her pale amber eyes. "You are a very good liar," Eleanor said. Smiling, Harper let out a loud, demanding chirp, hopped down from the machine, and trotted into the kitchen, waiting by the refrigerator for her raw chicken. The crisis had been averted. The county was satisfied. The secret was safe, and the sanctuary of the Victorian house remained unbroken. Eleanor Vance, the retired schoolteacher, had successfully outmaneuvered the bureaucracy to protect the apex predator that had saved her life. The years that followed the supervisor's visit were a quiet, beautiful testament to the improbable bond between the widowed schoolteacher and the rescued wildcat. The Victorian house, once a silent tomb, became a sanctuary of shared routines. Eleanor aged with a renewed quiet grace, the sharp angles of her grief softening into a peaceful acceptance. Harper, too, began to show the signs of age. The vibrant dark rosettes on her thick coat faded slightly, blending into a softer, grizzled grey, and she no longer leapt onto the high kitchen cabinets with effortless, explosive power. But their connection only deepened. The summers in Cedar Hollow are fleeting and fiercely hot. The long days filled with the relentless drone of cicadas and the smell of dry pine needles baking in the sun. During these months, Harper's behaviour shifted. The wildcat, biologically adapted to the brutal cold of the high altitudes, found the heat oppressive. She would spend her days stretched out on the cool, original tile floor of the large farmhouse kitchen, her massive body perfectly still, seeking the draughts that flowed under the heavy oak doors. Eleanor would open the large sash windows in the parlour, allowing the dry, warm breeze to circulate through the house. Harper would inevitably move to the wide wooden sill of the front window, her favourite observation post. She would sit for hours, a magnificent, spotted statue, watching the world outside. The neighbourhood birds, robins, blue jays, and the occasional, aggressive mockingbird were hyper-aware of the apex predator sitting behind the glass. They would perch on the telephone wires across the street, letting out sharp, warning calls, refusing to land in Eleanor's yard. Harper never chattered her teeth or pawed at the glass in frustration the way a domestic cat might. She watched them with a terrifying absolute stillness, her pale amber eyes tracking their flight paths with mathematical precision. She was calculating the variables, analysing the prey, even though she knew the glass barrier was impenetrable. "Don't even think about it," Eleanor would say lightly, walking past the window with a cup of tea. "Those blue jays have enough to worry about." Harper would simply swivel one tufted ear toward the old woman, a silent acknowledgement, before returning her intense focus to the birds. This renewed engagement with the world extended beyond the walls of the Victorian house. Eleanor, fueled by the energy and the profound emotional release she had found through caring for Harper, decided it was time to re-enter the community she had abandoned. She didn't return to the high school. She knew that chapter of her life was definitively closed. Instead, she walked down to the small Brick County Library on Main Street. The head librarian, a flustered woman named Martha who was constantly fighting a losing battle against declining budgets and failing technology, was shocked to see the stern, legendary Mrs. Vance standing at her desk. "Eleanor," Martha said, pushing her glasses up her nose. "It's wonderful to see you. How can Mott help you?" "Mott am here to volunteer." "Martha," Eleanor said, her voice carrying its familiar, authoritative cadence. "Mort understand the adult literacy program has been suspended due to lack of staff. That is unacceptable for a town of this size. Mott will be reinstating it, starting next Tuesday." Martha blinked, completely overwhelmed by the sudden, forceful offer. That would be incredible. "Eleanor, we have a waiting list of people, mostly seasonal workers and older folks." Tuesday, at 10 o'clock, Eleanor confirmed, turning and walking out of the library. The adult literacy classes became a profound source of purpose for Eleanor. She taught with the same rigorous, demanding standard she had always used, refusing to accept excuses or laziness. But the sharp, unyielding edge of her personality was tempered by a new, deep patience. She understood, better than anyone, the crushing weight of isolation and the terrifying vulnerability required to ask for help. She saw in the tired eyes of her adult students the same stark fear she had seen in Harper's eyes in the sterile isolation room of the animal shelter. She helped a 60-year-old ranch hand learn to read his granddaughter letters. She taught a young, overwhelmed immigrant mother how to navigate the complex bureaucratic forms required for her children's schooling. When she walked home through the snowy streets of Cedar Hollow on Tuesday afternoons, she felt a deep, resonant satisfaction. She was no longer waiting to die. She was actively participating in the messy, chaotic, beautiful process of living. And when she unlocked the heavy front door of the Victorian house, the silence was always broken by the deep, vibrating purr of the massive wildcat waiting for her in the hallway. Eleanor frequently reflected on the warning given to her by Jessica, the young worker at the animal shelter. "It's a monster." The irony was staggering. The monster, the highly aggressive feral animal scheduled for execution because it was deemed incompatible with human safety, had been the precise instrument of Eleanor's salvation. The wildcat had not been a monster, she had simply been a creature reacting logically to trauma and captivity. By recognizing that trauma, by offering a sanctuary built on respect rather than control, Eleanor had forged a bond that transcended the biological boundaries of species. She had saved Harper from the needle, but Harper had saved Eleanor from the silence. This quiet, peaceful existence, however, was brutally interrupted during their fourth winter together, testing the limits of their bond and proving, unequivocally, the lethal capability of the apex predator residing in the house. The incident occurred in early February, during a particularly bitter cold snap. The town of Cedar Hollow was dealing with a surge in property crimes, fueled by the rising cost of heating oil and a localized meth epidemic that was creeping into the rural communities. The targets were usually unoccupied summer cabins or isolated farmhouses. Eleanor S. Large, stately Victorian house, sitting slightly apart from the main cluster of the neighborhood, presented an attractive target. The thief, a desperate, twitchy young man named Kyle, assumed the elderly widow living alone would be an easy mark. It was 3 a.m. Eleanor was asleep in her bedroom on the first floor. Harper was resting on the heavy rug in the parlor. Kyle bypassed the heavy front door, moving silently to the back of the house. He used a heavy flathead screwdriver to pry open the old wooden sash window in the kitchen, shattering the frozen paint seal with a sharp crack. The noise was relatively quiet, easily masked by the howling of the winter wind outside. But Harper heard it. The wildcat didn't growl. She didn't move immediately. Her tufted ears swiveled toward the kitchen, pinpointing the exact location and nature of the intrusion. She recognized the sound of forced entry, violation of the secure perimeter. Kyle slipped through the window, his boots landing softly on the tile floor. He pulled a small, high-powered LED flashlight from his pocket, sweeping the beam across the kitchen, looking for cash, prescription drugs, or small electronics. Harper moved from the parlour to the kitchen doorway with absolute, terrifying silence. She didn't posture or attempt to intimidate the intruder. She was an assassin, operating on millions of years of evolutionary programming designed for lethal ambush. She dropped her massive body incredibly low to the floorboards, blending perfectly into the deep shadows cast by the kitchen cabinets. Her pale amber eyes locked onto the intruder, her pupils dilating to absorb the ambient moonlight and the harsh, sweeping beam of the flashlight. Kyle moved toward the hallway leading to Eleanor's bedroom, his flashlight beam bouncing off the floral wallpaper. He never saw the wildcat. Harper launched herself from the shadows, a 40-pound missile of dense muscle, sharp claws, at explosive velocity. The silence of the attack was absolute, right up until the moment of impact. She hit Kyle square in the chest, the kinetic force of the collision knocking him backward off his feet. Kyle screamed, a high-pitched, terrified sound as he crashed heavily onto the kitchen tile. The flashlight flew from his hand, spinning across the floor, casting chaotic, strobing shadows across the room. Harper didn't deliver a lethal bite to the throat. She was defending territory, not hunting for prey, but the violence of her defense was staggering. She pinned the struggling man to the floor, her heavy, furred paws pressing down on his shoulders with immense strength. She let out a terrifying, guttural roar, a sound that no domestic animal is capable of producing. It was a deep, vibrating concussive wave of sound that shook the windows and paralyzed the intruder with primal, absolute terror. Eleanor woke instantly, her heart hammering against her ribs. She recognized the roar. It was the sound Harper made when she was pushed to the absolute edge of her predatory instincts. She threw off the quilts, grabbed the heavy oak walking stick she kept near the bed, and ran into the hallway, flipping on the overhead lights. The scene in the kitchen was chaotic. The intruder was lying flat on his back, sobbing hysterically, his hands covering his face in a desperate attempt to protect himself. Harper was standing over him, her body stiff, the hair along her spine standing straight up, emitting a continuous, vibrating snarl. "Harper, stop," Eleanor commanded, her voice ringing with absolute, unyielding authority. The wildcat didn't retreat, but she stopped snarling. She turned her head, looking at Eleanor, her pale eyes blazing with adrenaline. "Stand down," Eleanor repeated softly. Stepping into the kitchen, Harper held her ground for 3 more seconds, ensuring the threat was completely neutralized. Then, she slowly lifted her heavy paws off the man's chest. She backed away, keeping herself between the intruder and Eleanor, never taking her eyes off the sobbing man on the floor. Eleanor walked to the wall phone and dialed the local police dispatcher. "This is Eleanor Vance," she said calmly, keeping her eyes on the intruder. "Might have a break-in at my residence. The intruder is currently subdued in my kitchen. Please send an officer." When the 2 local deputies arrived 5 minutes later, bursting through the front door with their weapons drawn, they found a bizarre tableau. The young man, Kyle, was still lying on the kitchen floor, shivering violently, completely traumatized. Eleanor was sitting calmly in a wooden dining chair, holding her oak walking stick. Harper was nowhere to be seen. The moment the police sirens had become audible in the distance, the wildcat had vanished. retreating to the dark, secure sanctuary behind the washing machine in the laundry room. Mrs. Vance, are you all right? The older deputy asked, holstering his weapon and moving to handcuff the intruder. I'm perfectly fine. Deputy, Eleanor replied. The deputy hauled Kyle to his feet. The young man looked around the kitchen wildly, his eyes wide with terror. There's a monster in here, Kyle screamed, his voice cracking. A massive, spotted monster. It came out of the shadows and tried to kill me. The two deputies exchanged a tired, skeptical look. They recognized Kyle. He was a known meth user with a long history of erratic behavior and drug-induced hallucinations. Sure there is, Kyle, the younger deputy said sarcastically, leading him toward the door. Probably a dragon in the basement. 2. Let us go. The older deputy paused at the door. Looking back at Eleanor, he broke the window latch. We'll have someone come board it up in the morning. You sure you okay? Eleanor, how did you manage to subdue him? Eleanor looked at the deputy, her expression perfectly serene. He tripped in the dark. Deputy Eleanor lied smoothly. He fell and hit his head on the counter. He was quite disoriented when Mott turned on the lights. The deputy nodded, accepting the plausible explanation. Lucky break for you. Have a good night. Mrs. Vance. When the police cruisers finally pulled away, their red and blue lights fading down the snow-covered street, Eleanor locked the front door and walked into the laundry room. She didn't turn on the light. Harper, she whispered into the darkness. The wildcat emerged slowly from behind the washing machine. She walked to Eleanor and pressed her heavy head against the old woman's leg, initiating a deep, comforting purr. Eleanor knelt down, burying her hands in the thick, spotted fur. She was shaking slightly, the delayed shock of the home invasion finally catching up with her. You a monster. All right, Eleanor whispered, tears pricking her eyes as she stroked the massive predator's neck. You my beautiful, perfect monster. The violent disruption of the home invasion did not fracture the peace of the Victorian house. Paradoxically, it solidified the sanctuary. Eleanor recognized that the wildcat had not acted out of malice or erratic aggression. Harper had executed a highly controlled, incredibly precise defensive maneuver. She had neutralized a threat without causing lethal harm, demonstrating a level of restraint that was astonishing for an apex predator. It was absolute proof that the animal was not a monster. She was a guardian. In the days following the break-in, Eleanor had a local contractor come and install heavy-duty locks on all the first-floor windows. She was reinforcing the house to protect herself from the outside world. She was reinforcing the perimeter to protect Harper's sanctuary from further intrusion. The incident also caused a subtle, profound shift in the power dynamic between them. Before the break-in, Eleanor had operated as the sole provider and protector. She had managed the environment, provided the raw meat, and shielded the wildcat from the county authorities. Now, the dynamic was balanced. They were operating as a true pack. Harper had demonstrated her willingness and ability to defend the territory, and Eleanor accepted this contribution with deep, unspoken gratitude. Their routine settled back into a peaceful, rhythmic cadence, stretching across the seasons. Years passed, blurring the sharp edges of time. The winters in Cedar Hollow remained brutal and unforgiving, but they no longer held any terror for Eleanor. She would sit by the roaring fire in the parlour, reading the heavy, dense novels she loved, while the massive wildcat slept peacefully on the rug beside her. But biology, unlike trauma, is a clock that cannot be permanently stalled by love or sanctuary. As Harper entered the latter stages of her life, the inevitable physical decline began. It started subtly. The explosive, silent leaps onto the high windowsills became less frequent, replaced by a slow, careful scramble. The thick, vibrant coat lost some of its luster, becoming brittle and sparse along her spine. Her hearing, once capable of detecting the heartbeat of a mouse beneath the floorboards, began to fade. Eleanor watched the decline with a heavy heart, but she did not panic. She had spent her life observing the natural world, and she understood that death was not a failure, it was the final, necessary chapter of the biological contract. She shifted her role from provider to palliative caregiver. When Harper could no longer chew the tough, raw elk muscle, Eleanor began grinding the meat into a fine paste, mixing it with warm broth to ensure the aging wildcat received the necessary hydration and caloric intake. She moved a heavy, plush dog bed into the parlor, placing it directly in front of the fireplace, eliminating the need for Harper to lie on the hard floor. The most profound change, however, was in Harper's behavior. As her physical strength waned, the wildcat's need for physical contact increased exponentially. The aloof, independent predator that had once spent hours patrolling the empty second floor now rarely left Eleanor's side. When Eleanor sat in her rocking chair to knit or read, Harper would slowly pull her stiff, aching body up onto the sofa next to her, resting her heavy head on Eleanor's thigh. The deep, vibrating purr was weaker now, a soft, rattling hum, but the intent was clear. She was seeking comfort, relying entirely on the old woman to provide the security she could no longer guarantee for herself. It was during these quiet, final months that Eleanor found herself thinking frequently of Arthur. She wished her husband could have met Harper. Arthur had been a man who loved the wild, chaotic energy of the Montana landscape. He would have been terrified of the massive predator at first, but his boisterous nature would have eventually won out. He would have spent hours trying to invent complex toys to stimulate the wildcat's predatory instincts, laughing loudly when Harper inevitably ignored them in favor of a simple cardboard box. Arthur had been her first anchor, the man who had grounded her sharp, intellectual edges with his simple, profound joy for life. David had been her second anchor, a vibrant, restless force that had pulled her gaze outward toward the wider world. When they were taken from her, she had drifted into the silent, suffocating abyss. Harper had been the third, and final, anchor. The wildcat had not replaced Arthur or David, she had simply provided the violent, necessary shock required to restart Eleanor's heart. By forcing the old woman to care for a creature more broken and terrified than herself, Harper had dragged Eleanor back from the edge of the void. The final autumn they shared was breathtakingly beautiful. The changing of the leaves in the Bitterroot Mountains was a violent explosion of colour, brilliant yellows, deep, blood reds, and burnt oranges contrasting sharply against the dark green of the evergreens and the stark, grey granite peaks. Eleanor spent hours sitting on the back porch, wrapped in a heavy wool shawl, with Harper resting on a soft blanket at her feet. They would watch the wind tear the leaves from the trees, scattering them across the dry, brown grass of the yard. Harper would watch the leaves fall, her pale amber eyes tracking their erratic flight paths, but she no longer tried to chase them. She was content simply to observe the passing of the season. In late November, exactly 12 years after Eleanor had defied the shelter director and carried the heavily sedated wildcat into her home, the biological contract was finally fulfilled. It was a quiet, peaceful Tuesday evening. The first heavy snow of the season was falling outside, blanketing the town of Cedar Hollow in a pristine, silent layer of white. Eleanor had built a small fire in the parlor. She was sitting on the sofa, reading a collection of Robert Frost poems. Harper was lying next to her, her head resting heavily on Eleanor's lap. The wildcat's breathing had been shallow and erratic all day. She had refused the warm broth Eleanor had offered her in the morning. Eleanor knew it was time. She didn't call a vet. She wouldn't subject Harper to the terrifying, sterile environment of a clinic in her final moments. She set her book down on the side table. She gently stroked the soft fur between the wildcat's tufted ears, feeling the fragile, prominent bones of her skull. "It's all right. My beautiful monster," Eleanor whispered, her voice steady and thick with a profound, peaceful sorrow. "You don't have to fight anymore. You can let go." Harper didn't open her eyes. She let out a long, slow exhale, the breath carrying the faint, wild scent of pine and old snow. Then the deep, rattling purr simply stopped. The massive, heavy body relaxed completely, sinking deeper into the sofa cushions. The fierce, intelligent light that had burned in those pale amber eyes was finally extinguished. Eleanor didn't cry. She sat in the quiet parlour for a long time, her hand resting on the still, warm body of the apex predator. She listened to the soft crackle of the fire and the absolute silence of the house. It wasn't the crushing, suffocating silence of grief that she had experienced 5 years ago. It was a clean, honourable silence. It was the silence of a completed journey. She had saved the wildcat from a terrifying sterile death in a concrete isolation room, giving her 12 years of peace, security and unexpected love. In return, the wildcat had broken the seal on the locked room of her heart, allowing the memory of her son to breathe again, and teaching her that even the most aggressive, terrifying manifestations of the natural world are capable of profound grace. Eleanor Vance buried Harper the next morning, digging the deep grave herself in the frozen earth of the backyard, beneath the branches of an ancient, sprawling oak tree. She wrapped the wildcat in the heavy wool blanket she had slept on during the blizzard, placing her gently into the dark earth. When the grave was filled and the snow began to cover the fresh dirt, Eleanor stood up, leaning heavily on her shovel. She looked out at the Bitterroot Mountains rising in the distance, their jagged peaks disappearing into the heavy winter clouds. She was 74 years old, and she was alone again. But as she walked back into the warm, quiet Victorian house, she knew that she was not empty. The house still smelled faintly of wild pine and raw meat. The heavy leather baseball glove still sat on the desk in the upstairs bedroom, a silent testament to the night the wild had offered her comfort. She walked into the kitchen, made a pot of strong black tea, and sat at the wooden table. She was a teacher who had spent her life explaining the complex narratives of literature, attempting to distill meaning from the chaotic actions of humanity. But the most profound, enduring lesson she had ever learned had not come from a textbook or a poem. It had come from a broken, terrified creature that the world had deemed a monster. It was a lesson she would carry with her for the rest of her days, a quiet, fierce certainty that anchored her to the earth. The wild is brutal, and the wild is indifferent, but the wild is also incredibly, devastatingly capable of love. And sometimes, when the silence of grief becomes too heavy to bear, the wild will knock on the door, step into the light, and bring you exactly what you need to survive. If this narrative touched your heart, leave a simple one in the comments. If you believe some bonds transcend the laws of nature, type 0. Mort read every one of them. And if you want more stories like this, quiet, real, and unforgettable, make sure you subscribe. We have another story ready for you. The Victorian house that Eleanor and Arthur Vance had purchased shortly after they were married was not merely a structure. It was an intricate, demanding character in the narrative of their lives. Built in the late Motamchinmizgay by a wealthy timber baron, the house was a sprawling, complex arrangement of dark, heavy mahogany woodwork, intricate stained glass windows and soaring, 14-foot ceilings. The architecture was designed to impose a sense of rigid, formal order upon the wild, chaotic landscape of the Montana frontier. Before the arrival of Harper, Eleanor had maintained this formal order with obsessive, almost tyrannical precision. The hardwood floors were polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the heavy, ornate furniture. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn at precise angles to protect the antique Persian rugs from the harsh afternoon sun. The house was a pristine, silent museum entirely devoid of the messy, unpredictable energy of life. The introduction of a 40-pound apex predator into this meticulously controlled environment was a profound, jarring contrast. Harper did not respect the mahogany wainscoting or the antique rugs. Her heavy, tufted paws, designed for gripping ice and tearing through dense underbrush, left faint, almost imperceptible scratches on the polished floors. She shed her thick, coarse fur with biological indifference, leaving grey-brown tufts clinging to the velvet upholstery of the parlour chair. Initially, this disruption of order would have triggered a severe anxiety response in Eleanor. But the presence of the wildcat forced a radical re-evaluation of what the house was meant to be. She realized that a house is not meant to be a museum, it is meant to be a container for living. This realization led Eleanor back to the massive, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves that dominated the parlour. Arthur had built them by hand, filling them with the dense, complex literature that Eleanor had taught for 35 years. During the long, quiet evenings of their first winter together, Eleanor began reading aloud. She didn't choose light fiction or romance. She chose the authors who had wrestled with the fundamental, brutal realities of existence: Melville, London, and her favourite, the uncompromising prose of Cormac McCarthy. She would sit in her rocking chair, the fire roaring in the hearth, and read the stark, violent descriptions of the American frontier. Harper would lie on the rug, her massive head resting on her paws, her pale eyes tracking the erratic movements of the flames. The wildcat obviously didn't understand the vocabulary, but she responded to the cadence of Eleanor's voice. The rhythmic, authoritative tone, completely devoid of the high-pitched anxiety that most humans directed at animals, seemed to act as a profound, settling anchor for the traumatized predator. When Eleanor read the final, devastating passages of Blood Meridian, her voice steady despite the horrific imagery, Harper would often initiate a deep, vibrating purr, the sound perfectly harmonizing with the dark, heavy atmosphere of the novel. It was a bizarre, beautiful tableau: the stern, elderly schoolteacher and the massive, scarred wildcat, bound together in the warm light of the fire, exploring the darkest corners of human literature while the Montana winter raged outside. Eleanor often found herself comparing the wild, uncompromising nature of the authors she loved to the physical reality of the animals sleeping at her feet. They Beotehat possessed a terrifying, undeniable authenticity. They both refused to conform to the comforting, artificial narratives that society constructed to hide from the brutality of the world. This deep, philosophical connection to the wildcat was inextricably linked to the memory of her son, David. David had not been a quiet, studious child. He had possessed a kinetic, almost dangerous energy from the moment he could walk. He was constantly bruised, constantly pushing the physical limits of his environment, climbing the tallest pines in the backyard and disappearing into the dense timber of the bitterroots for hours at a time. Eleanor had spent his childhood oscillating between profound terror for his safety and deep, resonant pride in his fearlessness. She remembered a specific afternoon when David was 12 years old. He had returned from the woods carrying a small, injured red-tailed hawk. The bird had a broken wing, its fierce, yellow eyes wide with panic. Arthur had wanted to call animal control immediately, warning David about the razor-sharp talons and the powerful beak. But David had simply wrapped his heavy flannel shirt around the struggling bird, holding it firmly against his chest, his young face set with absolute, unyielding determination. "She's scared, Dad," David had said, his voice completely calm. "She just needs a minute to realize we aren't going to hurt her." He had kept the hawk in a large cardboard box in the garage, feeding it raw meat with heavy leather gloves, until the local wildlife rehabilitator could arrive. He hadn't been afraid of the predator, he had respected its terror and offered its sanctuary. It was this specific memory that had flashed through Eleanor's mind when she stood in the sterile isolation room of the animal shelter, looking into the panicked, amber eyes of the massive bobcat. She hadn't just seen her overe kept no isolation in the wildcat's eyes, she had seen the echo of her son's fearless empathy. By demanding the release of the aggressive feral, she had unconsciously chosen to honour David's legacy in the most profound, dangerous way possible. When Harper had finally entered David's locked room during the blackout and retrieved the heavy leather baseball glove, she had completed the circle. The wildcat, operating on a level of emotional intelligence that defied scientific explanation, had connected the scent of the fearless boy to the crushing grief of the old woman. She had delivered the artifact, not as a toy, but as a bridge. The grief of losing David never completely vanished. It was a permanent, heavy stone sitting at the bottom of Eleanor's heart. But after the incident with the baseball glove, the water surrounding the stone was finally clear. She no longer avoided his memory. She began to speak his name aloud in the quiet house, telling Harper stories about his chaotic childhood and his fierce, unyielding spirit. "He would have loved you," Eleanor told the wildcat one afternoon, as Harper lay stretched out on the back porch in the summer sun. "He would have tried to wrestle you, and you would have absolutely destroyed him. He would have found that hilarious." Harper didn't open her eyes. She simply twitched one tufted ear, acknowledging the sound of the old woman's voice. The final years of their cohabitation were marked by this profound, integrated peace. The Victorian house was no longer a silent tomb or a rigid museum. It was a living, breathing ecosystem, vibrating with the shared energy of a retired schoolteacher and an apex predator. When Eleanor finally laid the heavy, lifeless body of the wildcat into the frozen earth beneath the ancient oak tree, she didn't feel the crushing, suffocating void she had experienced after the deaths of Arthur and David. She felt a deep, resonant completion. The wildcat had arrived as a broken, terrified creature, scheduled for execution because she was deemed incompatible with the human world. But in the quiet, demanding sanctuary of the Victorian house, she had proven that the human world is vastly more complex and capable of grace than the bureaucratic regulations of a county shelter could ever comprehend. Harper had been a monster to the shelter workers, a terrifying threat to the intruder, and a silent, deadly guardian to the Victorian house. But to Eleanor Vance, she had been the ultimate, unexpected teacher. She had taught the old woman how to breathe again, she had taught her how to confront the locked rooms of her own heart, and most importantly, she had taught her that even in the absolute darkest, coldest winters of the soul, the wild is capable of delivering exactly the salvation required, if you only have the courage to open the door and let it inside. In the quiet years following Harper's passing, the Victorian house did not revert to the crushing, sterile silence that had preceded the wildcat's arrival. It was a different kind of quiet now. It was the peaceful, resonant silence of a space that had witnessed profound transformation and survived it intact. Eleanor continued her routine, teaching adult literacy classes at the county library with unwavering dedication. She walked the snowy streets of Cedar Hollow, a respected, slightly intimidating figure, her heavy wool coat a familiar sight to the local merchants. But as she approached her 80th birthday, the physical realities of maintaining the massive, sprawling house began to outpace her endurance. The steep wooden stairs became a daily agonizing challenge. The sheer volume of wood required to keep the large parlor fireplace burning through the brutal Montana winters was more than she could reasonably hold. She knew it was time to leave. The decision was not made out of fear or beration. It was made with the same calm, ruthless logic she had applied to every aspect of her life. She did not want to be forced out by an emergency medical event, carried down the stairs on a stretcher while strangers packed away her belongings. She wanted to manage the transition on her own terms, dictating the final narrative of her time in the house. She contacted a local real estate agent, a brisk, efficient woman named Sarah, who had ironically been a student in Eleanor SAP English class 20 years prior. When Sarah arrived to assess the property, she walked through the pristine rooms, her heels clicking loudly on the polished hardwood floors. It's in remarkable condition. Mrs. Vance, Sarah noted, making rapid notes on a digital tablet. The original woodwork is flawless. But there are some unusual scratches on the wainscoting in the hallway, and the heavy oak door frames seem to have some deep scoring marks near the bottom. Eleanor didn't offer an explanation. She simply looked at the deep grooves left by Harper's massive claws, a permanent, physical testament to the apex predator that had once patrolled the space. They add character, Sarah, Eleanor replied smoothly. Leave them exactly as they are. The process of packing the house was a meticulous, unsentimental dismantling of her physical history. She donated Arthur's massive collection of tools and hardware catalogues to the local high school shop class. She boxed up the heavy, dense literature from the parlour bookshelves, gifting the entire collection to Martha at the county library. Eleanor, this is incredibly generous, Martha had said, staring at the dozens of heavy cardboard boxes stacked in the library foyer. But are you sure? These books, they were your life. They were the maps Mott used to navigate my life. Martha, Eleanor had corrected gently. Mott no longer need the maps. Mott know where Mott am. The most difficult task, the one she saved for the very end, was packing the contents of the upstairs bedrooms. She folded the heavy wool quilts she and Arthur had slept beneath. She carefully packed the antique china and the silver tea service. When she finally stood in front of the door to David S. room, she didn't hesitate. She turned the heavy brass lever, the same lever Harper had manipulated on that freezing night during the blackout, and pushed the door open. The room was exactly as she had left it. The posters, the narrow bed, the duffel bag. She walked to the small wooden desk near the window. David's heavy leather baseball gloves still sat there, exactly where she had placed it the morning after the storm. She picked it up. The leather was stiff and dry, the smell of neatsfoot oil faint now, replaced by the dry, dusty scent of the old house. She didn't pack the glove in a box. She placed it carefully into her large leather handbag. It was the only physical artifact of her son she chose to take with her. She didn't need the track trophies or the paperback novels to remember him. The glove carried the entire overwhelming weight of his memory, inextricably linked to the terrifying, beautiful night the wildcat had offered her comfort in the dark. On her final morning in the Victorian house, the moving truck had already departed, carrying her carefully selected furniture to a small, bright-assisted living apartment in Missoula, closer to advanced medical care. The house was completely empty. Eleanor stood in the centre of the large parlour. Without the heavy velvet curtains and the antique rugs, the room felt massive and echoing. The morning sun streamed through the bare front window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. She looked at the wide wooden sill where Harper had spent countless hours watching the birds. She walked into the kitchen, staring at the exact spot on the original tile floor where the wildcat had pinned the panicked intruder, defending the territory with explosive, lethal force. She walked down the hallway to the laundry room, opening the door and looking at the dark gap behind the washing machine where the terrified, broken animal had hidden for weeks, slowly learning to trust the stern old woman. The house was empty of physical objects, but it was saturated with the invisible, profound history of their cohabitation. It was a history that no real estate listing could ever capture. The new owners would see beautiful mahogany woodwork and high ceiling. They would never know that the house had served as a fortress, a rehabilitation centre, and ultimately a sanctuary where a profound interspecies truce had been negotiated and honoured. Eleanor walked out the front door, pulling it firmly shut behind her. The heavy deadbolt clicked into place with a definitive final sound. She walked down the front steps, leaning slightly on her wooden cane, and got into her old Subaru. As she drove away from Cedar Hollow, heading toward the highway that would take her to Missoula, she didn't look back in the rearview mirror. She looked out the windshield, toward the jagged, snow-capped peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains rising majestically in the distance. She knew that deep in that dark timber, the cycle of life and death was continuing with brutal, indifferent efficiency. She knew that other wildcats were hunting in the shadows, executing perfectly calculated ambushes, fighting the freezing wind and the deep snow. But she also knew, with absolute, unwavering certainty, that the wild was not simply a cold machine. It possessed the capacity for memory, for gratitude, and for an empathy that defied all human understanding. She had seen it in the pale amber eyes of a monster. She touched the heavy leather handbag resting on the passenger seat, feeling the shape of the baseball glove through the material. Eleanor Vance, the stern schoolteacher who had lost everything, drove toward the final chapter of her life feeling completely, perfectly whole. The silence of grief had been broken, replaced by the profound, enduring resonance of the wild. If this narrative touched your heart, leave a simple one in the comments. If you believe some bonds transcend the laws of nature, type 0. Mort read every one of them. And if you want more stories like this, quiet, real, and unforgettable, make sure you subscribe. We have another story ready for you. The profound, unexpected connection Eleanor forged with the wildcat was intricately woven into the dense tapestry of the literature she had spent her life teaching. When she sat by the roaring fire in the parlour, the heavy volume of Melville's Moby Dick resting on her lap, she wasn't simply reading words, she was vocalizing the terrifying, beautiful ambiguity of the natural world. She would read the long, rhythmic passages describing the vast, indifferent power of the ocean, the unfathomable depths where the great white whale operated outside the boundaries of human morality. As she read, her voice carrying the stark cadence of the prose, she would look down at Harper. The massive wildcat stretched out on the antique rug embodied that same indifferent power. She was a creature of the high timber, operating on millions of years of evolutionary programming designed for lethal efficiency. She didn't possess a human conscience. She didn't experience guilt or moral hesitation. She was like the white whale, a magnificent, terrifying force of nature, completely indifferent to the complex psychological narratives of the humans who observed her. Yet, paradoxically, it was this very indifference that offered Eleanor such profound comfort. Human empathy is often messy, fraught with expectation, judgment, and the heavy burden of shared anxiety. When Eleanor had lost Arthur and David, the sympathetic looks from the townspeople of Cedar Hollow had felt like physical blows. Their pity was a mirror reflecting her own shattered reality, constantly reminding her of what she had lost. Harper offered no pity. The wildcat did not care about the folded American flag or the empty chair at the dining room table. She cared about the immediate, physical reality of the environment, the heat of the fire, the predictable delivery of raw meat, and the security of the perimeter. By demanding Eleanor's attention in the present moment, Harper prevented the old woman from drowning in the past. Eleanor found herself deeply drawn to the writings of Thoreau during their first winter together. She would read Walden aloud, her voice competing with the howling of the Montana wind tearing at the heavy storm windows. Thoreau had sought isolation in the woods to strip away the artificial complexities of society, to confront the absolute fundamental realities of existence. Eleanor realized that Harper had brought the woods into the Victorian house. The wildcat was a living, breathing piece of the wilderness, demanding that Eleanor strip away her paralyzing grief and engage with the immediate visceral requirements of survival. This intellectual synthesis, the merging of Hattie-Go-Hat literature with the biological reality of the apex predator, transformed the silent, oppressive atmosphere of the house into an environment of deep, focused contemplation. The Victorian house itself seemed to absorb and reflect this transformation. Arthur Vance had spent years painstakingly restoring the massive structure. He had possessed a deep reverence for the craftsmanship of the late 19th century. He had spent entire weekends carefully stripping layers of cheap modern paint from the original mahogany wainscoting in the main hallway, revealing the deep, rich grain of the ancient wood. He had reglazed the intricate stained glass transom above the front door, ensuring that the morning light cast brilliant coloured geometric patterns across the hardwood floors. Before Harper's arrival, Eleanor had viewed these architectural details as painful artefacts of a dead man's labour. The house was a pristine, untouched monument to Arthur's absence, but as Harper's presence permeated the space, the house ceased to be a monument and became a living habitat. Eleanor began to notice the subtle environmental mechanics of the structure that she had previously ignored. She learned the specific agonizing groans the heavy timber frame made when the temperature outside dropped below zero, a sound that would cause Harper's tufted ears to swivel in rapid, defensive assessment. She observed how the angle of the afternoon sun, passing through the stained glass, created a warm, vibrant rectangle on the floor of the parlour. Harper would invariably seek out this specific patch of light, her thick spotted coat absorbing the radiant heat, her massive body shifting slowly as the earth turned and the light moved across the rug. The house was no longer a silent container for grief, it was a dynamic, functioning ecosystem, responding to the weather, the light, and the immense, predatory energy of its new occupant. This deep integration of the house, the literature, and the wildcat profoundly altered Eleanor's perception of time. During the 5 years of her absolute isolation, time had been a heavy, stagnant weight. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months, marked only by the changing of the calendar on the kitchen wall. She had been waiting for time to simply run out. But with Harper, time became sharp, defined, and critically important. The strict feeding schedule dictated the rhythm of the morning. The meticulous grooming sessions necessitated by the wildcat's heavy seasonal shedding defined the afternoons. The quiet evenings by the fire, reading aloud while the apex predator slept, provided a peaceful, structured closure to the day. Eleanor was no longer waiting to die. She was actively participating in the management of a complex, highly dangerous, and deeply rewarding relationship. The irony of the situation never ceased to amuse her. The county supervisor, the shelter director, and the young worker named Jessica had all viewed the terrified, wounded bobcat as a lethal threat, a feral monster that needed to be destroyed to protect the community. They had looked at the sharp claws, the heavy carnassial teeth, and the aggressive, defensive hissing, and they had seen only chaos. Eleanor, armed with the ruthless, observant logic of a seasoned educator, had looked past the biological weaponry and seen the profound terror. She had recognized that the aggression was not a manifestation of evil, but a desperate, biological imperative to survive. By offering the wildcat a sanctuary built on respect rather than control, Eleanor had not tamed the monster. She had simply provided an environment where the monster was no longer required to be monstrous. In return, the wildcat had done what all the human sympathy and psychiatric intervention in the world had failed to do. She had forced the stern, broken schoolteacher engaged with the physical world to confront the locked rooms of her own memory, and to realize that even in the absolute darkest, coldest winters of the soul, the capacity for profound, unexpected love remains intact. The 12 years they shared in the Victorian house were a masterclass in interspecies diplomacy, a quiet, beautiful rebellion against the crushing, sterile isolation of. And as Eleanor finally prepared to leave the house behind, driving toward the final chapter of her life in Missoula, she carried the weight of that profound, impossible bond not as a burden, but as a deep, resonant armor against the vast, indifferent silence of the universe.